The third and final option we have for stitching is the global stitch command, which is a great way to take multiple patches and get them all stitched together, something we'll be doing quite a bit of. Now this can be found under Edit NURBS, Stitch, Global Stitch. We'll go ahead and open up the options for it. Now let me create a few patches here. So we'll start off, I'll scale this up, let's shade up our viewport, and I'll make this, well, 4x4 I guess will work. Let's duplicate this, and I'll duplicate these two as well, like so. So I have 4 separate patches, and let's just say for the sake of argument that I'd like to stitch all of these together. Now our first option we have is how we want to handle stitching the corners of our patches. You have off, which means you're not even going to worry about stitching the corners. You'll leave them completely alone. You can set these to closest point, which means the corners will be stitched to the closest arbitrary point along a NURBS patch. So it'd be like when you select a surface point, any random point along the edge. Just whatever happens to be closest is where they're going to go. This can be a bit problematic because you can end up with corners not lining up with isoparms, which can be really nasty when you go to animate the model. So closest not is your alternative, which means that a corner will only be stitched to a corresponding knot, meaning like an isoparm on the surface. So this is what you'll be using most of the time. Next you have stitch edges, and this is how you're going to handle the stitching of edges. One, you can switch this off and you're not stitching edges, which is kind of pointless because you're not really doing this, you're doing this to get your edges all stitched up. You have closest point, which means each point along the edge will simply be stitched over to the closest arbitrary point of its corresponding edge. Again, not something you're going to want to do a lot. This can be handy if you're trying to stitch together 2 points that don't necessarily have the exact same parameterization or number of spans, but you don't really want to do that anyways. You want your surfaces that you're stitching together to have the same number of spans. You want them to be uniformly parameterized, and then everything is going to work out cleanly. So we'll go ahead and set this to match params, which means that each knot on the surface will match up to the nearest corresponding knot on the opposite surface. This is another reason why building 2 uniform patches such that all of the isoparms line up as you go in both directions becomes more and more important. It makes this operation a lot cleaner and a lot easier to do. You can control your stitch smoothness, which will, you can set this to off where you're not even worried about smoothness. That can give you some harsh tangencies, meaning you'll have some visible creases. You can set this to tangents, which will affect the NCVs as well as one CV back, allowing you to control a bit of tangency there. Or you can set this to normals, which will take the points that are sewn together and make sure that their normals align, which will clean things up in most cases. So this is actually what I find myself using probably more often than anything is these 3 settings right here on the end. You can tell Maya to stitch partial edges, which I think probably to show off, I would need to grab a couple of control vertices, maybe here. Let's just say all the way up to here, and let's scale these very close together, just to show that off here in just a moment. And let's keep talking, and then we'll take a look at actually performing this operation on all these patches. We have max separation. This is the maximum distance that patches can be from one another before a stitch takes place. Now that's going to work kind of in tandem with stitch partial edges, because if you have this activated and part of an edge is within that max separation, then only part of it will get sewn. If you don't have stitch partial edges set up, then there will be no sewing between those until the entire edge falls within max separation. So just keep that in mind. I think from here that's enough to go ahead and create the stitch itself. So let's take a look from a top view in our max separation. It looks like it's going to be just a hair under 3 units. So let's start off by setting this actually to 2 units. And we'll apply. And notice that the edges that were within 2 units from one another have indeed stitched together, but the edges that were not within that distance from one another have not. Now we do have a global stitch node, so we can change that max separation after the fact. So if I set this to maybe 2.5, boom, notice all edges come together. Now a second ago I had switched stitch partial edges off, so let me undo this. We'll set this back to 2, and as soon as I activate stitch partial edges, notice that these edges down here, these partial edges, do indeed get stitched. Don't turn this on unless you absolutely have to, because it can, in effect, really slow down calculations. It's, in most cases, going to be best to make sure you don't have to have it. So go ahead and leave it off and just bring up your max separation until everything stitches together, because that's going to be pretty much the standard you'll be using anyways. You have sampling, which is the number of samples that Maya is going to make across each edge to make sure that everything is stitched accurately. A sampling of 1 is actually going to work for most of the cases we should be running across. And if it doesn't work, you can increase the sampling to increase your accuracy. You probably will never have to increase this higher than maybe 4 or 5. Now, down from here, you have modification resistance. This is how much Maya is going to keep from disrupting your surfaces. So if you've got a lot of heavy sculpts and adjustments and modeling taking place on your surfaces before your stitch, turning this up can prevent Maya from making changes to that modeling as it tries to stitch these surfaces together. Now, the warning here is that if you turn this up too high, then your stitch areas, your edges where the stitch takes place, can be kind of messy. So you got to kind of play with it and find just the right value in your case. This is another area where messing with the node after the fact would probably be the best thing to do. That's really all there is to this tool. Now, in the workflow section, we talk about actually doing the global stitch and how you could apply that to bringing together multiple patches. This video just focuses on the actual settings for the tool and putting it to use. So that will wrap things up for this video. Thanks a lot.